The moment I saw the certified letter taped to my front door, I knew my Tuesday morning was about to go sideways in the worst possible way. It was February in Rochester, Minnesota, and the temperature had been hovering around -5 degrees for the past week. My name is Adrian Vance, and I had just become the latest victim of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, run by a woman whose very existence seemed designed to make everyone around her miserable. I peeled the envelope off the door, my fingers already going numb despite my thick winter gloves, and headed back inside. The heating system in my two-story colonial was working overtime, and I was grateful for the warmth as I stripped off my coat and boots in the foyer. I had just gotten back from my morning shift at the hospital where I worked as a nurse practitioner, and all I wanted was a hot cup of coffee and maybe a few hours of sleep before my next shift started at midnight. The letter was from Patricia Harmon, the president of the HOA and the most stereotypical Karen I had ever encountered in my 32 years of life. She was 53, had the signature blonde highlights with dark roots, drove a white Lexus SUV, and treated her position on the HOA board like she was the mayor of a small country. I had only lived in this neighborhood for 8 months, having moved here after accepting the position at Mayo Clinic, and Patricia had already made my life a living hell on at least 4 separate occasions. The first incident involved my mailbox being 2 inches too far to the left according to some obscure bylaw from 1987. The second was about my trash, cans being visible from the street for approximately 12 minutes past the designated pickup time. The third involved a complaint about my outdoor Christmas lights being the wrong shade of white. And the fourth happened just last month when she claimed my car was parked 3 inches over the line in my own driveway. But this letter was different. As I read through the official-looking document, complete with the HOA letterhead and Patricia's looping signature at the bottom, I felt my blood pressure rising in a way that probably was not healthy for someone in the medical field. Notice of fine. Failure to maintain common area walkway. Dear Mr. Vance, it has come to our attention that you have failed to shovel and maintain the public walkway adjacent to your property at 847 Millstone Drive. Per Section 12.4 of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA bylaws, all homeowners are responsible for snow removal on public walkways directly adjacent to their properties within 12 hours of snowfall cessation. As of this notice, you are 48 hours past compliance. A fine of $250 has been assessed to your account. Additionally, a daily fine of $50 will be added for each day the violation continues. You have 72 hours to remedy this situation and remit payment. I read the letter 3 more times, certain I was missing something. The walkway they were referring to was not even on my property. It was a public path that ran between my house and my neighbor's house, connecting the main street to a small park at the back of the neighborhood. I had never shoveled it because, quite frankly, I did not know I was supposed to. Nobody had mentioned this when I bought the house, and it was not in any of the documentation I had received when I closed on the property. I pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws, a document so thick it could double as a doorstop, and started flipping through pages. Section 12.4 did exist, but when I read the actual wording, I discovered something interesting. The rule stated that homeowners were responsible for walkways on or immediately adjacent to their property lines as designated by the HOA board. The key word there was designated. There had never been any official designation sent to me, no map showing which areas I was responsible for, nothing. I grabbed my phone and called my neighbor, Marcus Chen, who had lived in the neighborhood for 5 years and had warned me about Patricia when I first moved in. He answered on the third ring, sounding like I had woken him up from a nap. "Adrian, what's up, man? Did you get a letter from the HOA about shoveling that walkway between our houses?" There was a pause, and I heard rustling on the other end. "No, I did not get anything." "Why?" I explained the situation, reading parts of the letter out loud. Marcus let out a low whistle. "That is completely insane. I have never shoveled that walkway in 5 years. Nobody has. The city usually comes through with their equipment and clears all the public paths. Patricia is making this up." "That is what I thought. I am going to call her and sort this out." "Good luck with that," Marcus said with a laugh. "Last time I tried to reason with her, she threatened to fine me for having an aggressive tone in a phone conversation. I wish I was joking." After hanging up with Marcus, I found Patricia's number in the HOA directory and dialed. She answered after 2 rings, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Meadowbrook Hills HOA, Patricia Harmon speaking." "Hi, Patricia. This is Adrian Vance from 847 Millstone Drive. I just received your letter about the walkway fine, and I think there has been a mistake." The sweetness vanished instantly. "There is no mistake, Mr. Vance. The walkway has not been shoveled and you are in violation of our bylaws. But that is not my property. That is a public walkway. The city maintains those. The city maintains the main paths through the park, Mr. Vance. The connecting walkways are the responsibility of the adjacent homeowners. This is clearly stated in the bylaws." I read the bylaws, Patricia. It says walkways have to be designated by the HOA board. I never received any designation about that particular walkway. I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end, the way people do when they are trying to control their anger. "The designation is implicit based on proximity to your property. And before you argue further, I should inform you that I have photographic evidence of the unshoveled walkway, time-stamped and dated. The fine stands. This is ridiculous. I have been working double shifts at the hospital. We just had another snowstorm 2 days ago, and the entire city is buried. That walkway is not even used by anyone. That is not relevant to the violation, Mr. Vance. You have 72 hours to shovel the walkway and remit payment for the fine. If you wish to dispute this, you can submit a written appeal to the HOA board, which will be reviewed at our next monthly meeting in 3 weeks. 3 weeks? You are going to charge me $50 a day for 3 weeks while I wait for an appeal. Those are the rules. Have a nice day, Mr. Vance." She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, staring at my phone, feeling a level of rage that I usually reserved for dealing with insurance companies that denied my patients necessary medical care. This was not about the money, although $250 was not exactly pocket change. This was about principle. This was about a petty tyrant who got her kicks from wielding whatever small amount of power she had over her neighbors. I spent the next hour researching HOA laws in Minnesota, reading through consumer protection statutes and property rights cases. What I discovered was both enlightening and infuriating. HOAs in Minnesota had broad authority to enforce their bylaws, but they also had to follow due process. The fine Patricia had issued without any prior warning or clear designation of responsibility was legally questionable at best. But fighting it would require time, money, and energy that I frankly did not have. That is when I had an idea. A deliciously petty, perfectly legal idea. I pulled up a map of the neighborhood on my computer and started examining property lines and public walkways. The path between my house and Marcus's house was about 30 feet long and 4 feet wide. It connected to the main sidewalk on Millstone Drive, and led back to a larger path that circled the neighborhood park. But there was another path, one that I had not paid much attention to before. This path ran directly in front of Patricia's house, which was located at the very back of the neighborhood, right up against the park. Patricia's house was on Oakmont Circle, a small cul-de-sac with only 4 houses. The path that ran in front of her property was the main connection between the park and the only exit from that cul-de-sac. If that path was not cleared, the 4 families on Oakmont Circle would have to drive all the way around the neighborhood, adding about 10 minutes to their commute, just to get to the main road. I checked the weather forecast. Another major snowstorm was scheduled to hit Rochester tomorrow night, with predictions of 8 to 12 inches of snow and wind gusts up to 35 miles per hour. The storm was expected to last through Thursday morning, and temperatures were going to drop to negative 15 degrees, making it one of the coldest stretches of the winter. I looked at the HOA bylaws again, this time focusing on the property maintenance sections. And there it was, in beautiful black and white text. Section 12.4, subsection C. All homeowners are responsible for snow removal on public walkways directly adjacent to their properties within 12 hours of snowfall cessation. Patricia's house had the longest stretch of public walkway adjacent to it of any property in the entire neighborhood. If she wanted to play by the rules, then, by God, we were going to play by the rules. I spent Tuesday evening documenting everything. I took photos of the walkway between my house and Marcus's house, showing that it was indeed unshoveled. I took photos of Patricia's walkway, which was also unshoveled. I documented the timestamps, the temperature, the weather conditions. I printed out copies of the HOA bylaws, highlighting the relevant sections. And then I waited. The snow started falling Wednesday evening around 6 o'clock. I had just woken up from a nap before my night shift when I looked out the window and saw the first flakes coming down. The forecast had been accurate. This was going to be a big one. I got dressed for work, packed my overnight bag since I was planning to sleep at the hospital rather than drive home in dangerous conditions, and headed out to my car. Before I left, I took one more look at that walkway between my house and Marcus's house. It was still unshoveled, now with an additional 3 inches of snow from the previous storm plus whatever was about to fall tonight. I thought about clearing it, just to avoid the hassle. But then, I remembered Patricia's condescending tone on the phone, her refusal to listen to reason, her automatic assumption that she was right and I was wrong. I got in my car and drove to work. The storm ended up being worse than predicted. By Thursday morning, Rochester had received 14 inches of snow, and the wind had created drifts that were 3 and 4 feet high in some places. The hospital was chaotic, with staff calling in because they could not get to work and emergency rooms flooded with people suffering from car accidents, heart attacks from shoveling, and cold-related injuries. I did not get home until Friday afternoon. The city plows had been working nonstop, but they were overwhelmed. Main roads were passable, but side streets were still buried. When I finally pulled into my driveway, exhausted and running on about 4 hours of sleep in the past 2 days, I saw something taped to my front door. Another letter from Patricia. This one was even more official looking than the first. Second notice of violation. As of this date, you have failed to comply with the snow removal requirements outlined in your first notice. Your total fines now amount to $450, representing the initial $250 fine plus 4 days of additional fines at $50 per day. Failure to comply within 24 hours will result in further penalties and potential legal action. I crumpled up the letter and tossed it on my kitchen counter. Then I made myself a sandwich, took a hot shower, and climbed into bed. I slept for 12 solid hours. When I woke up Saturday morning, I felt almost human again. I made coffee, scrambled some eggs, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop. I pulled up the neighborhood Facebook group, which I rarely checked but knew was a hotbed of HOA drama. I scrolled through posts about the storm, people asking for recommendations for snow removal services, complaints about the city's slow response to plowing. And then I saw it. A post from Patricia, made Friday morning. To all Oakmont Circle residents, I am appalled by the lack of snow removal on the public walkway adjacent to the properties on our street. This is a safety hazard and a violation of our HOA bylaws. I have attempted to reach out to the responsible parties, but no action has been taken. I am calling an emergency HOA board meeting for this Monday to discuss enforcement actions. In the meantime, please use caution when attempting to access your homes. The comments section was a mix of confusion and frustration. Several people pointed out that the city usually handled those walkways. Others mentioned that with the severity of the storm, everyone was overwhelmed and doing their best. One person, bless their heart, pointed out that Patricia's own walkway appeared to be unshoveled and questioned why she was not taking care of it herself. Patricia had responded to that comment with a lengthy explanation about how she was the HOA president and was busy coordinating neighborhood responses and ensuring compliance with bylaws, and did not have time for manual labor. She suggested that the commenter focus on their own property maintenance rather than criticizing volunteer leadership. I could not help but laugh. This was too perfect. I spent Saturday morning doing my own research. I called a friend from work who lived in a different part of Rochester and asked him about his HOA. He confirmed what I had suspected, that most HOAs had some flexibility in enforcement, especially during extreme weather events. Fining someone for not shoveling during one of the worst blizzards of the year was not just petty. It was potentially illegal if it could be proven that the enforcement was selective or discriminatory. Next, I checked the property records for Oakmont Circle. Patricia's house was at 1204 Oakmont Circle. The public walkway adjacent to her property was approximately 150 feet long, much longer than the 30-foot section she claimed I was responsible for. If the same rules applied to her as applied to me, she was in violation of her own bylaws. I decided it was time to take a drive. I bundled up in my warmest winter gear, grabbed my camera, and headed out. The roads were better than they had been yesterday, but still treacherous. It took me about 10 minutes to navigate the neighborhood streets to Oakmont Circle. The scene was exactly what I had hoped for. The cul-de-sac had been plowed, but just barely. There was a narrow lane down the middle where one car could pass at a time, with enormous snow banks on either side. And the public walkway, the one that connected Oakmont Circle to the park and the rest of the neighborhood, was completely buried under at least 2 feet of snow. More importantly, the snow had drifted in such a way that it created an almost impassable barrier. The walkway was the lowest point in that area, like a small channel between two slightly elevated sections of land, and the wind had deposited enormous amounts of snow there. Even if someone wanted to walk through it, they would need to wade through thigh-deep snow for 150 feet. I took photos from every angle. I documented the street signs, the house numbers, the depth of the snow. I took photos of Patricia's house, which was a large brick colonial with white shutters and a 3-car garage. I noticed that her driveway had been professionally plowed, and there was a neat path from her front door to her mailbox. But the public walkway remained untouched. As I was taking photos, a man came out of the house next door to Patricia's. He was probably in his mid-40s, wearing a heavy Carhartt jacket and thick boots. He waved at me and I walked over. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, not unfriendly but definitely curious about why someone was taking photographs on his street. "Hi, I am Adrian Vance. I live over on Millstone Drive. I am just documenting the walkway conditions for an HOA issue." His expression changed immediately, shifting from cautious to knowing. "Oh, you are the guy Patricia has been complaining about, the walkway thing, right?" "That is me." "You are familiar with the situation." He extended his hand. "George Reynolds. Yeah, Patricia has been on a warpath about it. She keeps saying the neighborhood is going to hell because people are not following the rules. Meanwhile, that walkway in front of our houses has not been touched since the storm." "Has she said anything about getting it cleared?" George laughed, a bitter sound. "She says it is not her responsibility because her property line technically does not extend all the way to the walkway. There is a 2-foot strip of park property between her fence and the path, so she claims the city should do it. But the same logic would apply to my situation. The walkway she fined me for is also not technically on my property. Welcome to dealing with Patricia Harmon. Rules for thee, but not for me." I spent the next 20 minutes talking with George, who turned out to be a wealth of information. He explained that Patricia had become HOA president 3 years ago after the previous president, a reasonable man named Tom, had moved away. Since taking over, Patricia had increased fines by 300%, hired her brother-in-law's company to do neighborhood landscaping at inflated prices, and generally made life miserable for anyone who questioned her authority. "The worst part," George said, "is that most people just pay the fines because fighting her is not worth the hassle. She will drag things out, make your life hell, and even if you win, she will find some other way to come after you. My wife and I have been talking about selling and moving somewhere without an HOA. How many houses are on this circle?" I asked. "Just 4. Me and my wife, Patricia, and her husband, the Kowalskis across the street, and the Hendersons next to them." The Kowalskis are an older couple, really nice people. The Hendersons have 3 kids and both work full-time. Nobody has time to deal with Patricia's nonsense. An idea was forming in my mind. That walkway being blocked, how much does it affect you getting in and out of the neighborhood? "Oh, it is a huge pain. Without the walkway, we cannot cut through the park to get to the main road. We have to drive all the way around through the whole neighborhood. Adds 10 minutes each way. I have been late to work twice this week because of it." "Has anyone complained to Patricia about it?" "My wife mentioned it to her yesterday. Patricia said she was working on getting the city to come clear it, but they were backed up. Then she said something about how if people had been maintaining their assigned sections properly, we would not be in this situation. I swear, the woman is delusional." I thanked George for his time and headed back to my car. As I drove away, I saw a curtain move in Patricia's front window. She was home and had probably seen me talking to her neighbor. Good. Let her wonder what I was up to. Back at my house, I uploaded all the photos to my computer and started drafting a document. I outlined the situation, included the relevant bylaw sections, attached photos showing both the walkway I was allegedly responsible for and the much longer walkway adjacent to Patricia's property. I documented the weather conditions, the timeline of events, and the selective enforcement of the rules. Then I researched Minnesota HOA law again, focusing specifically on enforcement and due process. I discovered that Minnesota Statute 515B.3102 required HOAs to provide reasonable notice and an opportunity to be heard before imposing fines. Patricia's certified letter demanding payment within 72 hours with no prior warning did not meet that standard. I also found several court cases where judges had ruled against HOAs for selective enforcement of bylaws. By Sunday afternoon, I had a comprehensive 30-page document ready. I made copies and prepared to send them via certified mail to Patricia, to each member of the HOA board, and to the property management company that handled the neighborhood's administrative work. But I wanted to do one more thing first. I waited until Sunday evening when I knew most people would be home, and I posted in the neighborhood Facebook group. "Hi everyone, Adrian Vance here from Millstone Drive. I wanted to bring to the community's attention an issue with HOA enforcement that I think affects all of us. I recently received a fine for not shoveling a public walkway during the blizzard, despite never being notified that I was responsible for that walkway. I have since discovered that the same rules being used to fine me are not being applied equally throughout the neighborhood. I have documented numerous public walkways, including those adjacent to HOA board members' properties, that remain unshoveled. I believe this represents selective enforcement and an abuse of the HOA's authority. I have prepared a full report with photos and legal analysis, which I will be submitting to the board. I am also happy to share this information with any neighbors who are interested. I believe in following rules, but those rules need to be applied fairly to everyone. Thanks for your time." I attached several of the photos I had taken, including some clear shots of the walkway in front of Patricia's house. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, I had over 50 comments and 20 private messages. People started sharing their own stories of unreasonable fines and selective enforcement. Someone mentioned getting fined for having their garbage can lids slightly open. Another person talked about being threatened with legal action over the color of their front door, which had been the same color for 15 years, but suddenly violated a new rule Patricia had pushed through. The most interesting comment came from a woman named Susan Martinez, who lived on Birchwood Lane. She wrote that she was an attorney specializing in property law and HOA disputes. She said that based on what I had posted, I likely had a strong case for challenging not just the fine, but potentially the HOA's enforcement authority altogether. She offered to review my documentation free of charge. I messaged Susan immediately, and we arranged to meet Monday morning at a coffee shop downtown. Meanwhile, Patricia was having a meltdown in the Facebook group. She posted a long, rambling response about how I was creating discord in the community, how the HOA board had the authority to enforce rules, and how my post was bordering on harassment and defamation. She claimed that her walkway situation was different because of property line technicalities that I would not understand without reviewing the original neighborhood plat maps. She ended by saying that my behavior was exactly why strong HOA enforcement was necessary. The comments on her post were not sympathetic. People pointed out the hypocrisy. They questioned why she had time to fine others, but not time to shovel her own walkway. Someone mentioned that they had seen a professional plow service at her house, so clearly she had money to pay for snow removal if she wanted to. I went to bed that night feeling a mix of satisfaction and anxiety. I had essentially declared war on the HOA president, and I knew she was not going to take this lying down. But I also felt like I was doing the right thing, not just for myself, but for all the neighbors who had been pushed around by Patricia's petty tyranny. Monday morning, I met Susan Martinez at a coffee shop called The Daily Grind on 4th Street. She was a sharp-looking woman in her late 30s, wearing a business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. We sat at a corner table, and I showed her all my documentation. Susan reviewed everything carefully, taking notes on a legal pad. After about 30 minutes, She looked up at me and smiled. "This is really good work, Adrian. You have documented everything thoroughly, and you are absolutely right about the selective enforcement issue. But what is more interesting to me is this fine structure. A $250 initial fine with $50 per day after that is excessive, especially for a first-time violation with no prior warning. Minnesota law requires fines to be reasonable and proportionate to the violation. So I have a case. You have a very strong case. In fact, I think this goes beyond just your situation. If Patricia has been doing this to other homeowners, which it sounds like she has, you could potentially file a class action lawsuit against the HOA for systematic abuse of authority and breach of fiduciary duty." My eyes widened. A class action lawsuit? That seems extreme. Maybe, but hear me out. HOA boards have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of all homeowners, not to use their authority for personal vendettas or to generate revenue through excessive fines. From what you have told me and what I have seen in that Facebook thread, Patricia has been running this HOA like her personal fiefdom. That is illegal. We spent another hour discussing strategy. Susan suggested that I formally respond to Patricia's fine with a detailed rebuttal, requesting an immediate appeal hearing rather than waiting 3 weeks. She helped me draft a letter that was professional but firm, outlining all the legal issues with the fine and the selective enforcement. "One more thing," Susan said as we were wrapping up. "You mentioned that the walkway in front of Patricia's house is blocking the only convenient exit from her cul-de-sac. Yeah, it is a real problem for her neighbors. They have to drive an extra 10 minutes each way to get around it." How long has it been since the snow stopped falling? I calculated in my head. The storm ended Thursday morning. It has been 4 full days. Susan grinned. So by the HOA's own rules, she is in violation. The bylaws say snow must be removed within 12 hours of snowfall cessation. She is 96 hours past compliance. By her own fine structure, she owes an initial $250 fine plus 8 days at $50 per day. 8 days. The first 12 hours count as day 0. Then you have day 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the days since the storm. But she also fined you for days before the storm when you had not cleared the previous snow. If we apply the same logic to her walkway, which also was not cleared after the previous storm, we can go back several more days. I would estimate she owes at least $650 by her own standards. I could not help but laugh. So what do I do? Send her a fine notice? Exactly. As a homeowner and member of the HOA, you have the right to report violations. Send a formal complaint to the HOA board about Patricia's violation of the snow removal bylaws. Include all your photos, timestamps, everything. Request that the board impose the appropriate fines according to the established structure. See how she likes being on the receiving end. I left the coffee shop feeling energized. Susan had agreed to represent me pro bono for now, seeing this as an interesting case that could potentially set a good precedent for HOA accountability in Minnesota. She was going to review all the HOA bylaws in detail and prepare a comprehensive legal response. That afternoon, I drafted my formal complaint against Patricia Harmon. I was meticulous, using the exact same language and structure that she had used in her letters to me. I included photos with timestamps, citations to specific bylaw sections, and a detailed calculation of the fines owed. I sent copies via certified mail to all 5 members of the HOA board, including Patricia herself. Then I posted an update in the neighborhood Facebook group, letting everyone know that I had filed a formal complaint against the HOA president for the same violation I had been fined for. I did not go into details, but I said that I believed in accountability and that leadership should be held to the same standards as everyone else. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People were liking and commenting and sharing my post. Several neighbors reached out privately to tell me that they wanted to help in any way they could. A few people mentioned that they had also been considering filing complaints about Patricia, but had been afraid of retaliation. Tuesday morning, I got a phone call from a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from Douglas Harmon, Patricia's husband. His voice was tight and angry. "Mr. Vance, this is Douglas Harmon. I don't know what you think you are doing, but your harassment of my wife needs to stop immediately. She is a volunteer who dedicates countless hours to this community, and you are making her life miserable over a simple fine that you should have just paid. If you continue with this vendetta, we will have no choice but to pursue legal action against you for defamation and harassment. Call me back at this number so we can resolve this like adults." I saved the voicemail and forwarded it to Susan. She called me back within 10 minutes. "This is perfect. Do not call him back. Do not engage with either of them outside of formal written communication. If he calls again, do not answer. He just made a threat of legal action, which is exactly the kind of thing that shows they are trying to intimidate you into compliance rather than addressing the actual issues. I am not going to lie, Susan. I am a little nervous. These people live in my neighborhood. I have to see them around. I understand. But you have right on your side. You have documentation, witnesses, and the law. They have nothing but bluster and a history of abusing their authority. Trust me, this is going to work out." Wednesday afternoon, I received a response from the HOA board. It was not from Patricia but from the vice president, a man named Robert Chen, who I realized must be Marcus's brother or cousin based on the last name. The letter was brief and professional. "Dear Mr. Vance, we have received your complaint regarding potential bylaw violations by HOA President Patricia Harmon. The board takes all complaints seriously and will be conducting a full review. An emergency meeting has been scheduled for this Saturday, February 15th at 10 a.m. at the Neighborhood Community Center. Both you and Ms. Harmon will have the opportunity to present your cases. We appreciate your patience as we work to resolve this matter fairly. Sincerely, Robert Chen, Vice President, Meadowbrook Hills HOA." That Saturday meeting was going to be interesting, but I still had a few days to prepare. Thursday morning, something unexpected happened. I got a knock on my door around 9 in the morning. I was off work that day and had been planning to spend it catching up on laundry and meal prep. When I opened the door, George Reynolds from Oakmont Circle was standing there, along with 2 other people I did not recognize. "Adrian, I hope you do not mind us dropping by. This is Linda and Mark Kowalski, our neighbors on Oakmont Circle. We wanted to talk to you about the situation with Patricia." I invited them in and made coffee. As we sat around my kitchen table, the Kowalskis explained that they had been dealing with Patricia's tyranny for years. Linda was 72 and Mark was 75, both retired schoolteachers. They had lived in their house for 12 years, long before the HOA existed. "When we bought our house, there was no homeowners association," Linda explained. "It was just a quiet neighborhood with friendly people. Then about 8 years ago, some of the newer residents decided to form an HOA to maintain property values and coordinate snow removal and landscaping for common areas. We voted against it, but we were outnumbered. For the first few years, it was fine," Mark continued. "But then Patricia got elected president and everything changed. The fines started, the rules got more strict, and suddenly we were being treated like children who could not take care of our own properties." George jumped in. The Walkway situation is the last straw for all of us. Patricia fined you for something that is clearly not your responsibility, while ignoring the same issue in front of her own house. And when we complained about being trapped by the snow, she told us to stop whining and drive the long way around. My wife Beth has a medical condition that makes it hard for her to be in the car for extended periods. Those extra 20 minutes each day have been causing her real pain. I am sorry to hear that, I said. What can I do to help? Linda pulled out a folder filled with documents. We have been keeping records. Fines, complaints, meeting notes, everything. We want to join your fight against Patricia. If you are going to that meeting on Saturday, we want to come too and present our own complaints. I looked through their documents. It was damning evidence of a pattern of abuse. Patricia had fined the Kowalskis 17 times in 3 years for violations like having a lawn ornament that was too tall, parking a car in their driveway overnight during a thunderstorm, and having icicles hanging from their gutters. The total fines added up to over $3,000. Have you paid all of these? I asked. Most of them, Mark said bitterly. We are on a fixed income. We could not afford to fight her legally, so we just paid and tried to keep our heads down. But enough is enough. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything, organizing their documentation, and preparing a unified presentation for the Saturday meeting. Susan had given me permission to share her legal analysis with other affected homeowners, and the Kowalskis were thrilled to learn that there might be legal recourse. Friday, the day before the big meeting, I did something I had been putting off. I went outside with a shovel and cleared the walkway between my house and Marcus's house. It took me about an hour, and it was brutal work. The snow had been sitting for over a week, getting packed down by foot traffic and freezing into ice in some places. But I wanted to remove any ammunition Patricia might have to claim I was still in violation. While I was shoveling, several neighbors came out to help. Marcus showed up with his snowblower and made quick work of the heavier sections. A couple from across the street brought me hot chocolate. Even old Mrs. Patterson from the end of the block shuffled over to tell me she was rooting for me. That Patricia woman is a menace, Mrs. Patterson said in her quavering voice. She tried to fine me last year for having a bird feeder in my front yard. Said it attracted rodents and was a health hazard. I have had that bird feeder for 30 years. I told her where she could stick her fine. I laughed despite myself. What happened? She backed down. I think she realized that fining a 90-year-old widow for feeding birds was not a good look. But she has been looking for other ways to get back at me ever since. My mailbox is half an inch too tall apparently. I got a warning letter about it last month. By Friday evening, the walkway was completely clear. I took photos for documentation, and then went inside to prepare for tomorrow's meeting. I reviewed all my materials, practiced my presentation, and tried to get a good night's sleep. Saturday morning dawned cold and clear. The temperature had risen to a balmy 20 degrees, which felt tropical compared to the negative temperatures we had been experiencing. I got dressed in business casual clothes, loaded my folder of documents into my car, and drove to the neighborhood community center. The community center was a small building near the park, used for neighborhood gatherings and HOA meetings. When I arrived at 9:45, the parking lot was already full. I had to park on the street and walk back. Inside, the main room was packed. Folding chairs had been set up in rows, and they were almost all occupied. I recognized many of my neighbors, including George and the Kowalskis from Oakmont Circle, Marcus and his wife Jennifer, Mrs. Patterson, and at least 30 other people. The HOA board sat at a table at the front of the room. Robert Chen was there, along with 3 other board members I recognized from neighborhood events. Patricia sat at the center of the table, looking composed but with a tightness around her eyes that suggested she was not happy about any of this. Susan had come as well, sitting in the back row in case I needed legal support. She gave me a small nod when I walked in. Robert Chen called the meeting to order at exactly 10 o'clock. He explained that this was an emergency session to address complaints regarding HOA enforcement, and that everyone would have a chance to speak. He set a 5-minute time limit for each speaker to keep things moving. We will begin with Mr. Adrian Vance, who filed the initial complaint that prompted this meeting. Mr. Vance, you have the floor. I walked to the front of the room, carrying my folder. I had decided not to use notes, instead speaking directly to the board and the assembled neighbors. Thank you. My name is Adrian Vance, and I have lived in this neighborhood for 8 months. I work as a nurse practitioner at Mayo Clinic, and I love my job in this community. But I have been troubled by what I see as selective and unfair enforcement of HOA rules. I went through the timeline explaining the fine I received, my attempts to understand and comply with the bylaws, and my discovery that Patricia was not following the same rules she was using to fine me. I showed photos of both walkways, side by side, pointing out that Patricia's walkway was much longer and had been unshoveled for just as long as mine, if not longer. The issue here is not whether the rules should be followed. I believe in rules and community standards. The issue is that those rules are being applied selectively, based on personal preferences rather than consistent enforcement. As HOA president, Ms. Harmon has a fiduciary duty to treat all homeowners equally. By fining me while ignoring the same violation on her own property, she has breached that duty. I also brought up the excessive nature of the fines, the lack of prior notice, and the 3-week delay before an appeal could be heard. These practices are not just unfair. According to Minnesota Statute 515B, they may be illegal. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, and then several people started clapping. Robert Chen had to call for order. Patricia was given the opportunity to respond. She stood up, smoothing down her expensive-looking sweater, and addressed the room with a tight smile. I appreciate Mr. Vance's concerns, but I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding here about how HOAs function and about the specific circumstances of these situations. First, regarding my property, the walkway in question is not actually adjacent to my property line due to a strip of park land. Therefore, the bylaw does not apply to me in the same way. Second, as HOA president, I have responsibilities that include coordinating responses to situations like major snowstorms. I cannot be expected to do manual labor while also managing the administrative needs of this community. Third, Mr. Vance received his fine because his violation was specifically reported by another homeowner, whereas no one filed a formal complaint about the walkway near my house, until Mr. Vance did so as retaliation for his legitimate fine. Several people in the audience shouted objections, but Robert Chen called for order again. I raised my hand and was given permission to respond. Ms. Harmon, with all due respect, the bylaw does not make exceptions for property line technicalities. It says walkways adjacent to properties must be maintained. Your walkway is adjacent to your property, just as mine is adjacent to my property. As for your responsibilities as HOA president, I understand you are busy, but the solution is not to exempt yourself from the rules. The solution is to hire professional services, which the HOA budget can afford, or to acknowledge that these rules are unreasonable during extreme weather events and need to be revised. George Reynolds stood up and was recognized by the board. I would like to add that the walkway in front of Patricia's house being blocked has been a significant hardship for everyone on Oakmont Circle. We have all had to drive an extra 20 minutes per day, which might not sound like much, but it adds up. My wife has a medical condition that makes this genuinely painful for her. When I asked Patricia about getting it cleared, she told me to stop complaining. Linda Kowalski was next. She presented the folder of documentation showing years of fines and complaints. Her voice shook as she described how Patricia had made their retirement years stressful and expensive. We paid over $3,000 in fines for things like having a garden gnome that was 6 inches too tall and parking our car in our own driveway during a rainstorm. These are not reasonable rules. This is harassment. One by one, more neighbors stood up to share their stories. A single mother who had been fined for letting her kids draw with chalk on their own driveway. A veteran who had been threatened with legal action for flying an American flag that was slightly larger than the HOA allowed. An elderly man who had been fined for having medical equipment visible in his garage. The meeting went on for over 2 hours. By the end, it was clear that Patricia had lost whatever support she might have had. Even the other board members looked uncomfortable, with one woman, Susan Greenfield, openly taking notes and occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. Finally, Robert Chen called for a board vote on how to proceed. Based on what we have heard today, I move that all fines issued by President Harmon in the past 12 months be reviewed by an independent third party to determine if they were issued appropriately, and in accordance with our bylaws and Minnesota state law. I further move that President Harmon be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of this review. Susan Greenfield immediately seconded the motion. The other 2 board members, after a moment's hesitation, also voted yes. Patricia voted no, but she was outvoted 4-1. Patricia's face turned red. She stood up abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. This is absurd. I have dedicated 3 years of my life to this community, and this is how you repay me, by believing the lies of a troublemaker who has been here for less than a year. Patricia, this is not personal, Robert said calmly, but we have a legal obligation to ensure that the HOA is being run properly. These complaints are serious and they need to be investigated. Fine. I resign, effective immediately. Patricia grabbed her purse and coat and stormed toward the door. But before she left, she turned back and pointed at me. You have made a huge mistake, Mr. Vance. You have no idea what you have started. The door slammed behind her, leaving stunned silence in the room. The board quickly regrouped and appointed Robert Chen as interim president. They agreed to hire an attorney to review all of Patricia's actions as president and to make recommendations for reforms. They also immediately voted to suspend all pending fines pending the review. After the meeting, I was surrounded by grateful neighbors. People shook my hand, hugged me, and thanked me for standing up to Patricia. Mrs. Patterson told me I was a good man and invited me to dinner the following week. The Kowalskis were nearly in tears with relief. Susan Martinez pulled me aside. That went better than I expected, but keep your guard up. Patricia's threat at the end was not idle. People like her do not take defeat well. Susan was right to be cautious. On Sunday afternoon, I found my car had been keyed. Someone had scratched deep lines into the paint on both sides, causing probably $2,000 in damage. I filed a police report, though I had no proof of who had done it. Monday morning, I discovered that someone had filed a false complaint with the Minnesota Board of Nursing, claiming that I had been drinking on the job and providing substandard patient care. The complaint was completely fabricated, but I still had to spend hours writing a detailed response and gathering statements from my supervisors and colleagues proving that I was a competent, sober professional. Tuesday, my credit card was fraudulently used to make several large online purchases. I had to cancel the card and file disputes with the credit card company. Wednesday, I got a call from my landlord, except I owned my home, so this was obviously a scam. The person on the phone claimed to be from a collection agency saying I owed back rent. When I refused to provide any information, they threatened legal action. I documented everything and reported it all to the police. The detective assigned to my case, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Detective Morrison, seemed skeptical at first but became more interested when I explained the HOA situation. "We see this sometimes," he said. Someone gets vindictive after losing power or status in a community organization. Usually, it is just harassment, anonymous letters, that kind of thing. But keying your car is property damage, and filing a false complaint with the nursing board could be considered defamation or harassment. Keep documenting everything, and if you can get any proof linking these incidents to Miss Harmon, we can potentially press charges. Thursday evening, I got my proof. I had installed a doorbell camera after the car incident, and it captured footage of Douglas Harmon, Patricia's husband, walking up to my house at 2 in the morning and spray painting the word snitch on my garage door. I immediately called Detective Morrison and sent him the footage. He came by Friday morning to take a statement and told me they would be paying the Harmons a visit. The next few days were quiet, which was both a relief and unnerving. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Patricia and Douglas had gotten into a screaming match in their driveway, loud enough that several neighbors heard. Apparently, Douglas had not told Patricia what he did, and she was furious that his actions could have legal consequences for both of them. The independent review of the HOA's enforcement actions took 3 weeks. During that time, Robert Chen proved to be a capable and fair leader. He instituted new policies requiring board approval for any fine over $100, mandatory warnings before first-time violations, and a streamlined appeal process. He also negotiated with a snow removal company to handle all common area walkways, taking that burden off individual homeowners. The review's findings were damning. Out of 73 fines issued during Patricia's tenure as president, 41 were found to be either improperly issued, excessive, or applied selectively. The total amount of money that needed to be refunded to homeowners was over $18,000. The HOA's insurance company agreed to cover most of it, but Patricia and Douglas were personally liable for about $5,000 due to the gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty findings. But the story did not end there. Remember those false complaints and the harassment. Detective Morrison's investigation revealed that Patricia had not only been aware of Douglas's vandalism, but had actively participated in other harassment efforts. She had been the one to file the fake nursing board complaint, using information she had illegally obtained from neighborhood gossip and social media. She had also been behind several anonymous nasty letters sent to other neighbors who had spoken against her at the meeting. In late March, both Patricia and Douglas Harmon were arrested. Patricia was charged with filing a false report, harassment, and cyberstalking. Douglas was charged with criminal mischief for the vandalism. The charges were not serious enough for jail time, but they both faced potential fines, probation, and criminal records. The legal proceedings played out over the summer. Both Patricia and Douglas eventually accepted plea deals. Patricia pled guilty to filing a false report and harassment, receiving 2 years of probation, and a requirement to complete anger management courses. Douglas pled guilty to criminal mischief and was ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my car and garage, plus complete community service. As part of the HOA's settlement with affected homeowners, Patricia and Douglas were required to sell their house and move out of the neighborhood. They put their house on the market in June, and it sold within a month. I never saw them again after the day they loaded up a moving truck and drove away, though I heard they relocated to Duluth. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA underwent significant reforms. The board was expanded from 5 to 7 members to prevent any one person from having too much control. Rules were rewritten to be clearer and more reasonable, with an emphasis on maintaining property values without creating undue burdens on homeowners. The neighborhood became a much more pleasant place to live. As for me, life returned to normal. I continued working at Mayo Clinic, and I became more involved in the neighborhood community in positive ways. I helped organize summer barbecues and holiday events. I became friends with many of the neighbors, including the Kowalskis, who really did become like grandparents to me. The walkway between my house and Marcus's house became something of a neighborhood joke. We put up a small plaque that read, "The walkway that changed everything," and people would take photos with it. Marcus and I made sure to keep it meticulously shoveled every winter, though with the HOA now paying for professional snow removal services, it was not really necessary. One evening in September, almost exactly a year after I had moved to Rochester, I was sitting on my front porch enjoying the cool autumn air when George Reynolds walked by with his wife Beth. "Evening, Adrian," George called out. "Beautiful night, is not it?" "Sure is." "How is everything going, Beth?" "Much better," she said with a smile. "No more long drives around the neighborhood. My back is thanking you." We chatted for a few minutes about neighborhood stuff, upcoming events, the upcoming winter, and whether we would get as much snow as last year. After they walked on, I sat there thinking about everything that had happened. It had been a stressful, exhausting experience, but in a weird way, I was grateful for it. I had learned that standing up to bullies was important, even when it was scary. I had learned that communities could come together and make positive changes. And I had learned that sometimes, the best thing you can do is not back down when you know you are right. The next winter came, and with it, more snow. Rochester got hit with several significant storms, though nothing quite as dramatic as the blizzard that had started everything. But this time, the walkways were all clear within hours of the snow stopping. The professional service Robert had hired was efficient and thorough. There were no fines, no complaints, no drama. I thought about that first winter sometimes, about Patricia's smug voice on the phone telling me the fine stood, about the rage I had felt reading that letter. I thought about my decision to not shovel that walkway, to let the snow pile up and trap the very people who had been so quick to fine others for the same thing. It had been petty, sure, but it had also been the catalyst for real change in the community. Susan Martinez, the attorney who had helped me, ended up taking on several more HOA cases across Minnesota. She told me that my case had inspired her to focus her practice on helping homeowners fight back against abusive HOAs. She even appeared on a local news segment about HOA reform, citing the Meadowbrook Hills situation as an example of why oversight and accountability were necessary. The nursing board complaint was formally dismissed with a notation that it had been filed maliciously, which actually helped protect me from any future false allegations. My supervisors at Mayo Clinic were incredibly supportive throughout everything, with my department head telling me that he respected how I had handled the situation with integrity and documentation. My car got fixed, my garage door got repainted, and my credit card disputes were all resolved in my favor. The financial damage was minimal in the end, though the stress had taken its toll. I started seeing a therapist for a few months to work through the anxiety of being targeted and harassed. She helped me understand that my response to Patricia's bullying had been healthy and appropriate, and that setting boundaries with unreasonable people was an important life skill. In the spring, the HOA organized a neighborhood-wide garage sale and community festival. It was the first time in years that everyone actually seemed to enjoy an HOA event. There was no tension, no one worried about violating some obscure rule. Kids played in the park while adults socialized and actually got to know each other. I ran into Robert Chen at the festival. He was manning the grill, flipping burgers and hot dogs for anyone who wanted them. "This is nice," I said, accepting a burger. "Very different from last year." Robert laughed. "You can say that again. You know, I almost moved away after Patricia became president." My brother Marcus and I both talked about it. But then you stood up to her, and it reminded me that communities are worth fighting for. So thank you for that. I was just defending myself. I did not set out to become some kind of neighborhood hero. Maybe not, but that is what happened. You gave people permission to speak up. You showed them that bullies can be stopped if you stand up to them with facts and the law on your side. That matters. As summer turned to fall and fall to winter again, I reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. The neighborhood felt like home now, in a way it had not when I first moved in. I knew my neighbors. I trusted the HOA board. I felt safe and comfortable in my own house. And every time it snowed, every time I looked out at that walkway between my house and Marcus's house, I remembered that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance could lead to the biggest changes. I had not shoveled a walkway, and in doing so, had helped free an entire community from tyranny. The irony was not lost on me that the same woman who had tried to fine me into submission had ended up losing everything because she could not see her own hypocrisy. Patricia had been so focused on controlling others that she had lost control of herself. She had been so determined to enforce rules that she had broken bigger ones. And in the end, justice had prevailed. On a cold February morning, almost exactly 2 years after that first fine letter had appeared on my door, I was shoveling my driveway when a car pulled up. It was a young couple, probably in their late 20s, looking at houses in the neighborhood. They rolled down their window. "Excuse me, do you live here?" the woman asked. "I do." "Adrian Vance," I said, walking over to their car. "We are thinking about buying a house on Oakmont Circle." "Can you tell us what the neighborhood is like? Is the HOA reasonable?" I smiled. "The HOA is great now. Really reasonable people, fair rules, good communication. It was not always that way, but we made some changes a couple years ago that really improved things." "That is good to hear," the man said. "We have heard horror stories about HOAs. They are legitimate concerns, but this community learned from its mistakes. We have good people here who care about doing the right thing. If you move here, you will be in good hands." They thanked me and drove off. I went back to shoveling, thinking about how different my answer would have been 2 years ago. Back then, I would have warned them away. Now, I could honestly recommend the neighborhood. That evening, I got a text from Susan Martinez. She was representing a homeowner in Bloomington who was dealing with a situation remarkably similar to what I had gone through. She wanted to know if I would be willing to speak to her client, share my experience, and offer encouragement. I agreed immediately. If my experience could help someone else stand up to an abusive HOA, then all the stress and harassment had been worth it. Over the next year, I ended up speaking to 4 different homeowners in various Minnesota communities who were fighting their HOAs. I shared my documentation strategies, my legal research, my story of how speaking up had led to positive change. 2 of those homeowners successfully fought their fines and helped reform their HOAs. 1 moved away, deciding it was not worth the fight. 1 was still in the middle of the battle when I last heard from them, but each conversation reminded me why what I did mattered. HOAs are supposed to serve homeowners, not control them. When that relationship becomes inverted, when the board starts treating residents like subjects rather than neighbors, someone has to stand up and say enough is enough. I was that someone for Meadowbrook Hills. And while I never planned to become a neighborhood activist or an HOA reform advocate, I was proud of what we had accomplished together. The snow continued to fall each winter in Rochester. The walkways continued to get cleared, efficiently and without drama. Life went on, as it does, with the normal ups and downs that everyone experiences. But whenever I saw that little plaque on the walkway, whenever someone new to the neighborhood asked me about the HOA, I smiled and remembered the winter when I refused to shovel, and in doing so, helped dig our community out from under the weight of petty tyranny. It was not about the snow. It had never been about the snow. It was about principles, about fairness, about refusing to let bullies win. And in the end, standing up for those principles had made all the difference.